Welcome to Tuesday. It's the 9th of March, 2021. Thanks for listening and watching the Day Weather Podcast. Well, this podcast is coming with a warning label. First of all, we got to warn you about some stormy weather coming up, but this is also going to be a very long podcast. What we're going to do is we're going to give you our normal podcast, and then the second half of the podcast is going to be our long-range outlook for spring and summer for this region. So what you might want to do is either get a cup of coffee or maybe watch the second half of this podcast later for the long-range outlook. And of course, these podcasts stay posted for quite a while, so you can go back and look at that long-range forecast later. So let's get to the current weather pattern. Storm number 1 comes in late today through Wednesday, impacting many parts of Wyoming, parts of Nebraska, parts of Colorado, and South Dakota, with Wyoming kind of the bullseye of storm number 1. Confidence continues to grow in the Four Corners storm that could bring a prolonged and major impacts to the region Monday through Monday, starting Friday and continuing through Monday. Our confidence is growing in what we're seeing, and we'll talk about that and show you some maps here to show you why we're confident. Stock growers and travelers, you need to pay really close attention. We have not seen a week of stormy weather like this all winter. Really, we got to go back to October when we had as big of a storm as this one in terms of the potential for snow on the plains for many of you. So this is going to be a little bit of a shock to the system, especially after a week of what has been spectacular spring-like weather. These are the current winter weather advisories for the western United States as we go through the next 24 hours. And you can see, here's the strip of winter weather across portions of Wyoming, Nebraska, and into South Dakota, then up across parts of Montana and into the higher mountains of the Pacific Northwest, Oregon, and parts of California. This is for high fire danger due to a dry southwest wind into those areas there. But you can see where we're going to start to see some winter weather unfold later today and tonight. Today, this is what the jet stream pattern looks like as of this afternoon. We've got this big trough that's just off the coast of Washington and Oregon, and then we've got a piece of it. This little piece doesn't look like much, but there's a lot of moisture with it. This piece of moisture and energy is going to team up with some colder air slipping in on this tail of much colder Canadian air up here coming on in. So basically, the two air masses, moist Pacific, colder Canadian, will come together right over central Wyoming and into the region later today and tonight. And here it is. Again, it doesn't look like much, but this is by noon tomorrow. So this is going to overrun the colder air coming in from here. Here's the main event. Coming on in to Northern California is the secondary low system, which is going to go right this way during the day Thursday. This is what it looks like through Thursday morning with precipitation. See the blue and the darker green? This is where the Pacific moisture and the Canadian air will meet. And this is the area here where you're going to get the heaviest precipitation right along this axis here, the Pine Ridge we call it, the higher ground from the northern panhandle of Nebraska and southern South Dakota through places like Douglas, Lusk, and into Casper. This east-west ridge is where that east-west band of heavier moisture will be, but also along the central and southern Bighorns, front foothills and higher mountains, and the front range of the southern Bighorns will get into the act as well as the east slopes of the Wind Rivers around Lander. Interstate 80 will be impacted as well tonight late and into tomorrow morning, and you're going to get some snow into the western mountains of Colorado and into Wasatch of Utah as well. As we go look at the snowfall totals, this is where the heavier snow is going to be, again, in that east-west areas along that Pine Ridge. So that is storm number 1. It's going to be impactful for travelers and livestock interests, but it will also bring beneficial moisture. Now, here comes the second event. The second event, that upper level low by Friday morning, is now in Southern California. So the storm coming through tonight is kind of like the warm-up band for a big concert. So you have the warm-up band come in Wednesday night and Thursday and tonight, and then you have the main band, the second event, coming in this weekend. So by Friday morning, the upper level low starts to get consolidated better over Southern California. And then as we go forward into Saturday, this is for noon Saturday, we have a cohesive, well-developed, closed-off low. I want you to notice something. For those of you who watch and listen to the podcast, This pattern looks remarkably similar to what happened a week ago when a small cutoff 500 millibar low, upper level low, went right across Colorado. And we talked about it was small, it didn't have cold air, so it wasn't going to turn into a big storm, but it was a moderate storm. Well, this pattern is almost identical, except two things are different. Number one, the colder air that's coming in behind the cold front will sit right here. So there's cold air for this storm to work with. Also, it's much better organized, stronger, and more moist than the other one. And we also talked about bowling ball season, to where you get these upper level lows that break off from the main low and they just look like a bowling ball rolling across the country. This is exactly what's happening. Again, another indication where in weather forecasting, a lot of it is recognizing patterns and recognizing patterns you've seen in the past and applying them to what you think is going to happen going forward. So with this low stronger, developing near the Four Corners region, cut off from the main jet stream, but also having the ability to tap into colder air that's coming in tonight and Wednesday, this storm is going to come together and become better organized and strong. Also, it's cut off from the main flow of air with the jet stream. So what will happen is, we'll put a big S on this for slow mover. So what will happen is, due to the slow movement, Gulf of Mexico moisture will be drawn into the system, and on the surface, we're going to have low pressure forming down here that's going to bring a surface upslope wind into the Front Range and High Plains region. So you're going to see a lot of energy and moisture lifted up along the Front Range, upslope, and a lot going on. You're also going to have colder air slip down the Front Range of Colorado and Wyoming. We call that cold air damming, where cold air comes in along and near the I-25 corridor. By noon Sunday, so this is noon Saturday, this is noon Sunday, it really doesn't go very far, and we have an intensifying upper level low, upslope conditions at all levels into eastern Wyoming, northern Colorado, western Nebraska, and western South Dakota. This is pretty much a textbook March storm. Slow moving, moist, prolonged upslope. This, if it comes together, and our confidence is growing that it will bring the best moisture we've seen in a long, long time that's badly, badly needed. But we're going to have some major travel impacts for airports, for interstates, if this all comes together. Now, this is several days away. Things could change, but we want to give you a heads up that things are looking better. It's getting more organized and confidence is growing. This is what it looks like if you put Storm 1 and Storm 2 together. This is the prediction from the European model. This is inches of water. So the water equivalent of the storm could be this high. Now, usually what we do is we take these numbers and we cut them in half because the computer models many times in these storms will over forecast the amount of moisture. But even if you cut these amounts in half, it's still extremely impressive. And if you can convert it to snow, that is a lot of snow. Again, use caution with these graphics because we're going to show you weather graphics in the coming days and these numbers are going to change. But where you see the pink and the purple and the blue is where the impacts are likely going to be the highest with this storm. There is a lot of agreement between the European, the Canadian model, and the U.S. modeling on the strength of the system, the timing of the system, and where it's placed. Now, there's variations, and there always will be, but we're getting more and more assured that some type of large storm along the Front Range is going to happen between Friday and early Monday. It's just going to be the devil's in the details. Look at the cold. This is by Wednesday of next week. These are temperature deviations compared to normal. So we're going to completely forget about this week of 60 and 70 degree temperatures. These are temperatures as much as 25 to 30 degrees below average by the middle of next week. And this will be especially true if we put a lot of snow on the ground. So winter, folks, the screaming message here is winter is not over. So stock growers and travelers, be prepared for tonight and Wednesday. Confidence is growing in that storm for Friday and the weekend. As we get closer, as we get things better figured out in placement and timing, we'll work out a better forecast for snow accumulations and impacts on who will see the most, who will see the least. One thing is for certain, we're going to have high travel impacts with the second storm in the entire Western High Plains and Rocky Mountain West between Friday through Monday. Okay, now we're going to go into the second part of the podcast. And this is a request. I had several requests for folks to provide a long-range forecast for the spring and summer 2021. Now, I have to put the disclaimer in here. This is a long-range forecast, so we can only talk in general terms. What I always like to tell people is trend is your friend. We can tell you with a fair amount of confidence what we think the trends will be, but getting into specifics this far out for something where we're looking out 6 months is something that is not going to be, we just not have that ability yet. But we're pretty confident in what the trends are going to be. First of all, La Nina is going to continue. And as you know, listening and watching this podcast, I talk about La Nina all the time and how it's had a big impact. Also, that's going to impact us this summer is soil moisture. Now, this storm that's coming, these two storms will really help the soil moisture profile. But we are suffering from really poor soil moisture all across the Western High Plains and the east slopes of the Rockies. So even with this storm, our soil moisture is still going to be below normal. The North American monsoon. Remember last year we had almost no monsoon season. So how does that play into the outlook this summer? We'll talk about that. Severe weather. In La Ninas, you can have more severe weather when it comes to hail and tornadoes, and we'll talk about that. And then will the drought conditions persist? We have gone into drought. We went into drought during the summer and fall of 2020. We can blame La Nina for most of that. So if we're going to continue La Nina into the spring and summer, we're likely going to see drier than normal conditions persist. And we'll take a look at that as well. Here's the current La Nina chart. You can see all the blue out in the Pacific. So La Nina is, it's in the moderate category. We wouldn't call it terribly strong, but it's certainly a very robust La Nina that extends across to the Pacific. And the Pacific Basin's temperatures all across the Pacific Basin have been dropping over the past 12 months. Here's the latest La Nina forecast. This is kind of where we are right now. The green line represents the average of all the computer modeling, and all the averages basically keep La Nina in some state through the spring, through the summer, and into early fall. Now, a lot of times our La Ninas last 1 year. However, when you have a La Nina pattern that coincides with a solar minimum, which we are in or just getting out of right now, you have a higher tendency for 2-year La Ninas. That's why we tend to see these really dry, droughty periods around every 9 to 11 years. Matches up well with the solar cycles. Now, I want to show you the difference in soil moisture, because one thing that we did have going into spring of 2020 was we had a very wet 2019. 2019 was a wet year for the Western High Plains and Rockies and most of the nation. And so we had good soil moisture. Even though our spring and summer was dry, we were able to utilize soil moisture, especially for crops and rangeland conditions, for a good part of 2020. But what has happened in a year is we've gone into a major soil moisture deficit. So as we mentioned, while we have this wet spring storm coming on up, which is going to help, we've got a big deficit with soil moisture. So if you have poor soil moisture going into the spring and summer season, that makes the summer harder to rain. It's harder to get rain when the ground's dry. And so that is something we have this year we didn't have last year. This is the latest drought monitor. You can see all the droughty conditions in the western United States. Now let's talk about the Pacific Ocean again. What we talk about a lot of times is La Nina and El Ninos, which is really what I want you to focus on. But there's something called the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, which is basically a combination of all the El Ninos and La Ninas put together. But the Pacific goes through 20 and 30-year cycles of going through colder phases and warmer phases. Right now, we're in what's called a negative PDO, or basically going into a negative phase where the Pacific is starting to trend colder. And that's one reason why the La Nina is more robust. And so when we have these negative, we're in a negative Pacific Decadal Oscillation, we do see some historical trends. Now, this AMO is called the Atlantic Meridional Overturning. I'm going to talk about that later, but that's what the AMO means. It's something that happens out in the Atlantic. But what I want you to notice here is that when you have a negative PDO, a colder Pacific, and a positive AMO, this is the regime we're in now. Historical trends, where you see the red here, is that it's a drier than normal pattern. Again, this is another indication how our oceans really drive our climate here in the western United States. So historical trends indicate a drier pattern going into the summer and spring season. when you have a negative PDO, you have longer, stronger La Niñas, which we have, more active tornado seasons, which is historically true, more East Coast hurricanes, less Gulf Coast hurricanes, and it's colder globally. And that's exactly what we've seen, and I'll show you that in a minute with the latest global temperature pattern. Also, where we are in the solar cycle is really important. When we hit the bottoms or we hit the solar minimums, we tend to have stronger La Niñas. Notice the last 3 solar cycles have decreased in trend. We're now starting our new solar cycle, and if that amplitude continues to drop, which many solar scientists are saying will happen, some solar scientists, including NASA, thinks that our amplitude of this next solar cycle will be the same as the last one. However, many are predicting it to be lower in amplitude, and right now that is the trend. That continues. That is a forecast that overall, globally, and in the Pacific is colder, which means more La Niñas are coming, I'm afraid to say, over the next 10 to 20 years. If you were to take a look at global temperatures, look at the drop in global temperatures that have happened. These are satellite-derived temperatures of the lower atmosphere. These are not from airport thermometers or city thermometers or backyard thermometers, but these are derived from satellites, so they're more accurate. The anomaly of global temperatures has dropped sharply since October and November to where we're only 0.2 degrees Celsius above the 30-year average. So temperatures are going to continue to cool globally as the sea surface temperatures, especially in the Pacific and the Atlantic, continue to cool. And that is going to play a role going forward in the spring, summer of 2021 and into 2020. Also, I want you to look at the right side of this graph here. In La Niñas, the top part of here is showing the differences in tornadoes and hail. In La Niñas, notice the frequency of tornadoes in this part of the country here is higher than in El Niños. Also, there is a higher incidence of hail in this part of the country in La Niñas as opposed to El Niños. So we could have more in the way of severe weather this spring and summer because of that. Let's talk briefly about the North American monsoon. Last year we called it the no-soon because it almost didn't show up at all. That was one reason why the wildfires in the western United States were bad, because the monsoon, those summertime thunderstorms, just were not there. They just weren't consistently there. During the heat of the summer, we normally have a high pressure system in the south central United States. The deserts of Mexico get hot, creating low pressure, and that clockwise flow around the high and the counterclockwise flow around the heat of the deserts draw that moisture northward into the region. In La Niñas, though, the top of these monsoons get cut off. And so what will happen is your monsoon just isn't as robust, and it doesn't get as far north into these areas here. Last year, it only really got down into there. So with La Niña continuing into the summer of 21, we're concerned that the monsoon will again be weaker. However, as I'll show you in the long-term maps, we might have a little bit of a better monsoon season than last year. Now let's take a step forward and take a look at the long-range forecast looking at spring and summer. What I'm going to show you are precipitation and temperature maps in 3-month segments. So if we were to average March, April, and May together, anywhere you see brown is predicting below average precipitation, white is average, green is above average. Despite the fact we've got a big spring storm coming, the long-range modeling and the fact that we're in a La Niña suggests that overall, the next 90 days could still be drier than normal. Keep in mind, though, these are the wettest months of the year. The wettest months of the year in the western United States where we live is March through June. So it's going to rain, it's going to snow, but we're probably still going to end up shorter than those averages when we take a look at these long-range trends. Temperature-wise, anywhere you see yellow or orange, above average temperatures, blue below average, white average, for those 3 months, temperatures are likely going to be above average. This will be especially true, I think, in mid-April through May. As we leave March, April, and May, take a look at precipitation for June, July, and August. You can still see there's a lot of brown, below average precipitation for that 3-month period across most of the Rockies and High Plains. Now, you may notice here that we've got a little bit of green. This is where we're maybe a little more optimistic, if the modeling is correct, that maybe the monsoon is a little bit better this year. But the tendency from March through August is below average precipitation across our neck of the woods. What we're hoping for, we're keeping our fingers crossed, is that if La Nina isn't as strong by the time the monsoon, that North American monsoon kicks in, which is usually July, August into early September, that maybe that time of year will be better than it was a year ago. But that's all we can really hang our hat on, because with La Nina continuing, historical tendencies are for another warmer and drier than normal summer in the western high plains and Rockies. And we look at temperatures for June, July, and August. You're going to be looking at above average temperatures across most of the central and western United States. So when you have warmer than normal temperatures, you're likely going to have below average precipitation again. Let's just hope it wasn't as severe as it was in 2020. But in the hopes, the chances of us going into a wet pattern overall this spring and summer is just not looking likely until that La Nina goes away. And interestingly enough, La Ninas tend to make the land masses warmer, even though the ocean temperatures are colder. This is especially true during the summer season. So, to sum things up, La Nina is going to continue through at least early summer, probably fall. When you have a negative Pacific decadal oscillation combined with solar minimums, so we have both. We just got out of the solar minimum. We have a negative PDO. You tend to have 2-year-long La Ninas. So we're likely going to have it continue. That soil moisture is going to make a big difference. We don't have that this year. So any spring storm that we get, like the ones coming on up, boy, we need as many as we possibly can to recharge that soil moisture profile. Pattern will likely bring far above average temperatures and below normal precipitation for the Rockies, the high plains, the southern plains, and parts of the western Corn Belt. So drought conditions are likely going to persist. Now, I do think that maybe the overall rainfall in 2021 will be slightly better than 2020, hopefully because of a slightly better monsoon season, but it's going to be tough sledding to get out of this dry cycle. Now, we're likely going to go out of it. Again, going back to historical periods when we've seen this before, probably 2022, 2023, the La Nina will fade and we'll go into some type of a warmer pattern in the subtropical Pacific. But usually these La Ninas at the bottom of solar cycles tend to line up for a couple of years. If it goes 3 years, then we've got bigger problems, but it's too far out to talk about a 3-year La Nina. We're hopeful that 2022 and 2023 will be out of it. Thanks for listening and watching, and we'll talk to you tomorrow.